Hello.
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 Hey.
Mute.
Boy.
Hello. Welcome everyone. We will ask if you can mute your audio as you join us. We'll get started super quickly. We're just letting a few more folks in, and yeah.
Hi.
Hello. Welcome.
Mama, there's someone in the background of Jupiter.
Okay. Welcome everyone. Super excited to see many of you return. And welcome to those joining us for the first time. We're about to start momentarily. So yeah, Prati, I think we can go ahead.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I had to leave. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We're gonna ask everyone to mute your microphones. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. So welcome to our new series where you get a chance to meet a space professional. This event is being hosted by Space in collaboration with AstroSTEM Labs. We at Space would like to acknowledge the various Indigenous lands we reside on as an organization, including the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We would also like to thank our sponsors, Ontario Regional Malayali Association and Stonehaven Dentistry, for supporting our new initiative. So a little bit about our host today. So Space is a social enterprise with headquarters in Mississauga, Ontario. Space raises awareness specifically about space exploration and its connections to science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics for youth, educators, and the general public. We provide programs and products for all our grade levels. AstroSTEM Labs is an after-school STEM club based in Mississauga, Ontario. AstroSTEM Labs' mission is to make learning of STEM subjects fun and exciting to children in grades 1 to 12. They conduct online coding, robotics, engineering, math, science, and chess classes for kids across Canada. You can follow us on our website, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Please tag us with hashtag CDN Space Talks. This is a reminder that this event is being recorded. So if you do not feel comfortable being recorded, then you can turn your camera off, and same with your mic. And if you do consent to being recorded, then you can leave your camera on. If you have any questions for our speaker throughout the talk, please submit them on slido.com, and the code is Space Talks. If you have a mobile device, you can use it to scan this QR code, and it will also take you to slido.com. So some basic ground rules is that everyone please listen closely and respectfully. Ask questions when you're curious or confused. Keep your questions and comments short, as we want to get through as many as we can. And most importantly, have fun. These are our talks that are going to come up for the rest of the summer. So for next week, we have Dr. Allison Brady, and she is going to be talking about using Earth to look for life on Mars. And for our speaker today, we have Dr. Hilding Neilson. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the University of Toronto. He uses models and observations to understand the physics of stars and exoplanets. He works to include Indigenous knowledge and methods in the study of astronomy and space to build a more inclusive science. Tonight, he will talk to us about astronomy and Indigenous knowledge. So once again, please submit your questions at slido.com, and the code is Space Talks. And now up to Dr. Hilding.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be here. And I'm just going to do the hard thing of trying to share my screen and hope that my computer doesn't blow up. It has happened before, so I can never risk it. So I hope everyone can see my screen. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. And I want to talk to you all about the stories of this land. We're in Canada. Canada is a very young country. But before that, people have lived here since time immemorial. Myself, I am Mi'kmaq, and I grew up in Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada. Newfoundland is home of the Mi'kmaq peoples and used to be home of the Beothuk. And the Mi'kmaq people live across Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and parts of Quebec. So we have my family live in a huge area of Canada. There are Indigenous peoples everywhere in this country. As we saw in the land acknowledgement, we're on the land of the Seneca, the Wendat, the Mississaugas. And if we travel north, we have Cree cousins. Farther north is the Inuit. If we go west, we reach Blackfoot and onto Salish and Swiatmik people. Everywhere we go in what we call Canada, there is home to Indigenous peoples. And I mean that everywhere. So wherever we are watching, staying on our computers, we're on land that people have walked on for centuries and millennia before we came around. And in that way, that creates connection. If you can imagine you going to school every day, you walk the same path, you get familiar with a few trees, the sidewalks, maybe the pothole, and you become more and more familiar with it, and it becomes part of something you recognize. And that way, having been here millennia with our elders telling the stories, sharing the land, Indigenous people have connections that are makes it part of the land, part of our identity and who we are. Being on this land for millennia means we get to observe the sky, the night sky for all that time. We get to observe stars, planets, maybe sometimes supernovae. Sometimes you get to see the explosion of the stars that come with the unaided eye. We watch the sun, watch how everything moves across the sky, and we relate to it because it's connected to where we are and who we are. And so we have all these centuries of history and ongoing process of learning about the night sky and astronomy through these as Indigenous peoples on this land, not just through schools and textbooks. And we tell stories. That's one of the coolest things about Indigenous knowledge is we tell stories. We talk, and we use the stars to help tell us stories. We write our stories in those stars. But those stories depend on where we are on the land. Like, think of it this way. How many of you have been to Australia? How many of you if you ever get to Australia, get to view the night sky? What if you go to the Arctic and see the night sky? Are we going to see the same stars? We're going to see the same constellations. Stories we tell are different depending on where we go and where we are. And just take, for instance, the moon. Even now, it kind of blows my mind that if I go to Australia, the moon's going to look different than if I'm hanging out in Toronto or in Ontario or somewhere else in Canada. The way we view the moon, the moon's upside down if we're in Australia, or to Australians, we're upside down viewing the moon. And so the stories we tell, in the north of a person in the moon might be different in the south to a rabbit or an ant in the moon. The phases of the moon are different. The shapes are a little different. It's a whole different perspective. So for many Indigenous peoples, our knowledge is related to where we are. Our understanding of the universe is connected to us and our place on the land. So, as astronomers, Indigenous peoples have one foot in have both feet on the ground, but they're looking up. And are not, and if I go somewhere else on land, my astronomy knowledge will change. We could think of one really cool example. If you go to the southern United States, where the Navajo Dene and the Pueblo peoples live, it's very dry and desert, lots of mountains and hills, and the sun can be blazing hot. In one small place called Chaco Canyon, there's a cave. And at the entrance to the cave, there are stones built up, and 3 stones built up in a very particular way. But when you look in the cave, you'll see drawn on the wall these spirals. Depending on the time of year, sunlight will pass through those stones and shine against the wall. And you will create this, what we call a sun dagger shape. That sun dagger shape varies at different times during the year. Where we see the bright light, that's the image of it during the summer solstice. It's the longest day of the year, where you see the 2 arrows, one on the edge and one close to the middle. That's an equinox. And so the indigenous peoples were using the sun dagger to tell what time of year it is, with great ease. And this was important because that spiral is a map. We might learn from our GPS on our phone, you go 1 kilometer east or 1 kilometer west to go somewhere. But for many of the Navajo Dene and the Pueblo people, it's going inwards and outwards is the map. So you're spiraling outwards as you're moving away, or you spiral inwards to come here. And so the arrows tell you where to go in the path you take. And that's connected to the people they are and how they live their lives. If we go far north, you can see here this map. This is a star map if you're in the far northern Canada during the coldest day, the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice. So you're far north, it's dark all the time. And you can see that east and west are backwards because you're looking up. So they're reflected of the earth. And if you can look up and you see what looks like the Big Dipper. You might see, if you look towards the south, you'll see what looks like Orion. And if you look a little bit to the left of Orion, you'll see a star called Sigurd. And I'm sorry, I'm probably mispronouncing because mine is horrible. This is a special star. The Inuit told a story that this star is 2 foxes, a white fox and a red fox, and it's chasing each other's tail. I don't know, do any of you have a dog that chases his own tail? It's kind of funny to watch. But when 2 foxes do it, they're playing. And the red and the white chasing the tail, if you imagine it from afar, you're watching, you'll just see a little red, a little white, and just keep blinking back and forth. It's like a flickering star. You ever see like a twinkling, flickering star? And this occurs near the horizon much more than if you're high in the sky. So if because it's close to the south, it's close to the land near the horizon. So it'll flicker a lot more. And that flickering changes depending on the weather that's coming in. Inuit would use this star and map its flickering. So if it flickers a lot, you can expect cloudy, high pressure system coming in. If it flickers a little, it's calm and steady. The star in the north is used for weather prediction. Now, if you move further south, the star Sigurd moves higher in the sky. So it becomes less useful for flickering because of the angle towards the sky. Now, I should tell you, you might know this star. We call the star in the west Sirius, the dog star. So it's one of the brightest stars in the sky. But in the north, it is an indicator of weather, which is quite important if you're in the dark, in the middle of winter, and the weather can be dangerous. If we travel towards the western Canada and northwestern United States, all across the land, there are these structures that were built called medicine wheels. You can see a picture on your screen. It looks like a wheel with spokes coming out of it and little knots all around the wheel. And those knots are places where an observer can stand. And if you follow the lines of the spoke towards the sky, you'll see stars rising and setting at different times. You can think of it this way, depending on the time of the year, Stars might be higher in the sky or lower in the sky. And so that motion we use as a calendar from rising and setting. So many indigenous peoples in the West use the medicine wheel as an observatory, a calendar, and a sacred place. And the bighorn is a very particular special medicine wheel. There are hundreds known by people in the West, but this one's special. And an archaeoastronomer, this is pretty cool. An astronomer who does archaeology. That's pretty awesome. You get to do both. Jack Eddy, he looked at this medicine wheel and he figured out that depending on where you stand, you can track time with high precision. Like I mentioned, the sun dagger is a calendar, so is the medicine wheel. Different stars rise and set at different times along the path you see, depending on how close it is to the summer solstice or the winter solstice. So during the summer solstice, you can stand at one point and follow the line to where the sun will rise or where the sun will set. And then you can follow it from different stars as well. Some stars will rise a few days before the solstice. Some will rise a few weeks before at different areas. So you actually get a very precise calendar and timekeeping set for the year. This is really cool. You're tracking calendars with high precision. So the point I want to make is just from these three examples, is that stories have purpose. Indigenous peoples use stories to talk about time, to talk about place, to talk about weather predictions and how to live on the land. And I'm going to tell you about a story from my people. This is a story called Mewn and the Seven Bird Hunters. Mewn is a black bear, and Mewn is the Mi'kmaq word for bear. You know why we call the bear Mewn? The sound the bear makes. Mewn. The bear is telling us his name is Mewn. And for the Mi'kmaq people, the bear is an important source of food and fat for the winter. The bear is our kin, but it helps sustain us. So the story tells us about how we hunt and how we live. But this is also a constellation in the sky. If you think to a really cool constellation called the Big Dipper, and you can see it in this picture towards the upper right, there are 4 stars in a bowl. To the Mi'kmaq, that bowl is Mewn. Then you see a bright star just coming off it in the handle. That's robin, followed by chickadee, gray jay, passenger pigeon, blue jay, barn owl, and saw-whet owl. And all of these birds live in the land I come from, which is Mi'kmaq, or the land of the Mi'kmaq. This story is also very important because all these birds are part of the land, but one of them is extinct today. Our cousin, our kin, the passenger pigeon, is no more. And so we also use the story to remember him. The story tells us about the hunt. And we tell this story by getting up early in the morning. We get up a couple hours before dawn to observe the sky. And so if you get up a couple hours before dawn, you'll see the Big Dipper on the left of your screen pointing downwards. Because when we watch the Big Dipper every night will go around the North Star once a night. If we observe it every night at the same time and watch it throughout the year, it'll go around a circle again in the whole other time in the year. And so in the spring, the Big Dipper is pointing downwards. Mewn is waking up from its long sleep. It's tired. If I get up in the morning and I haven't eaten for a while, I'm a little cranky. And so Mewn is going searching for food. But very quickly, Robin spies Mewn and realizes Mewn would help feed his people and family for months from the fat and the grease and the meat. So Mewn grabs his bow and arrow and he calls his friends. Chickadee flies up quickly, grabbing a pot, followed soon after by Gray Jay and passenger pigeon and blue jay, and the two owls. And we don't see the two owls here, but they're beyond the handle. They begin to chase Mewn across the land. But Mewn is, he's quick. Mewn knows how to evade them quick. And so in the summer, Mewn is running across the land, evading the birds. And the season grows long. Towards the fall, some of the birds have lost track for the hunt. They've fallen below the horizon. But Mewn is also getting tired. Mewn is ready for hibernation. So Mewn stands on its hind legs and growls at the robin and the other birds. Robin sees a chance to feed his family and fires an arrow, striking Mewn in the heart. Blood comes from Mewn all over Robin, and Robin flies into the trees, shaking it off, staining the leaves red for the fall, but leaving one mark on his chest. Mewn passes to the other life, and the birds gather to celebrate the hunt, to share and feast, meals that will sustain them for the winter. So in the winter, Mewn is on his back, sleeping and resting, waiting for the spring to wake up again. At the same time, the birds during the winter are feasting, celebrating, sharing stories. And this is very much connected to our place on the land. But the story tells us all kinds of things about astronomy and about our place. So, I usually like to ask people, what are some lessons they take away from a story like this? What's something you learned from a story like this that you see that wasn't explicitly told? We learn lots of different lessons from this story. There's the cycle of life. Mewn rises in the spring every year. It tells the Mi'kmaq when to hunt. The Mi'kmaq don't hunt the bear in the spring and the summer. We hunt in the fall. In the spring and summer, it's for the bears to take care of their families and to sustain themselves. It talks about sharing in community. No hunt is alone. The gift of the bear is shared with your family and your community and elders. It tells us about guide stars. The Big Dipper goes around the North Star. It tells us which way north is, and the motion starts. And being that the Big Dipper goes around the North Star, we call these circumpolar stars, so it tells us about them. And the story tells us about the nature of bears and birds and our kin. And so I always have to stop and ask this question. We have a story of the bear for the Big Dipper in Mi'kmaq. The Cree peoples have a similar story, and many other First Nations have stories of bears relative to this constellation. But only the Greek constellation of Ursa Major has a bear with a tail. Have any of you seen a bear with a tail? I haven't. Not with a long tail. It's kind of funny. And the story of the bear with the tail, comes from the god Zeus. In frustration, he grabs the bear by the stem of his tail and swings him over his head, stretching it out almost like a Disney movie, and throws the bear into the stars, leaving the bear with a sore tail, not a long tail. And today we use that constellation for this land, even though its heritage is Greco-Roman and came through current popular usage because of French and English settlers primarily. But we don't see Mewn in our constellations or in our textbooks, in our books or in our stories or in our classrooms. And that's kind of colonization. That doesn't share Indigenous peoples in our discussion or our place on this planet. And it's about replacing our stories with Ursa Major and a bear with a tail. But I digress. we see similar stories or lessons in the stories of the Mi'kmaq moons. For the Mi'kmaq people out east, every moon has a different name, which is mostly true, because there can be 13 moons in the year, and the 13th moon we don't really know. But the 12 moons we know we have every year, every one has a name. And you can see it in this calendar here. So there's, starting at the top, you see Keskikwichi, which I just mispronounced, unfortunately. But you know, it cycles around from the left: fish spawning time, snow blindness time. The one with the bright sun, you have to worry about snow and being blinded by snow. Leaves falling off the trees time. This is going backwards in time. Egg gathering time. Frog croaking time on the lower left. We call a moon after a frog, it croaks. Leaves, green time. Feathers, time when birds shed feathers in the lower right. Berry picking, and so on. And all these different months are related to how we live and how we work during the year. On the upper right, you see what looks like a river with maybe snow or ice. That's ice breaking time. So it's not a good time to go out on a frozen lake. And so we use the moon to remind us about that story. What's really cool about this, interesting about this, is that most of the moons, all these moons are named after different times and related to what we do on the land. So one of the moons is feather gathering time, where people will go around and gather feathers fallen from different birds. And so we have a moon named after that. Or we have a moon for berry picking time. And berry picking is a lot of fun because eating blueberries is pretty awesome. So I like that time. And so we use these moons to tell stories and know where we are in terms of the time and place. But not all moons, or all moons are related to something in nature, except for the one, which is here on the top. We refer to this in English as chief moon time. We named it after our elders. And it's a good question, why? Why is this time special? Now this time corresponds to around the winter solstice. So it's dark longer in the day. And it's related to how we view the moon. So if I'm hanging out here on Earth and the sun's on the left, this here time or picture tells us that it's the summer solstice or towards the summer solstice. Because if I'm standing in Ontario, which is on the upper right, when the Earth spins around, the sun's going to be higher in the sky. At the same time, the new moon and the full moon are lower in the sky. So the moon, the height of the moon is opposite of the height of the sun. So in the summer, the moon is lower in the sky, but in the winter, near the solstice, it's highest in the sky. So we call it the chief moon because the full moon at that time is highest in the sky. And there is a time to listen to our stories from our elders and to listen to our teachings. I'm telling you stories from Indigenous knowledges, but this is an astronomy talk. And the reason I'm very passionate about this is because I think listening and understanding Indigenous knowledges will only make us better scientists. To see the world and nature through different lenses, not just experimenting and robotics and rocketry, but seeing it through the eyes of Indigenous knowledges and other knowledges. It's good for us to see nature in more detail and more vibrant. And so it makes us better scientists. It makes us better scientists because we're talking about going into space. I mean, who wants to go into space? Who wants to go to Mars? Who wants to go visit the red planet and see the dust and see places where asteroids hit and experience a whole other world? And scientists are working towards that, as well as rich people like Jeff Bezos and SpaceX and NASA and companies and governments, people are working towards this. The way we talk about it is through the idea of colonization. We talk about it in the same way we talk about how people settled in North America, in Canada, long before Canada was formed. People have been talking about going to Mars since the 1950s, since the beginning of the space program. The idea was we'll send rockets to Mars with little pointed noses, and people will walk on Mars and break up rocks, get to see all these different things. And we'll have heroes like Matt Damon in The Martian, who will go to Mars and be alone, surviving in an environment that's hard for humans. It'll be the frontier, the edge of exploration. And we use this language somewhat unfortunately, because the language of the frontier, the language our ancestors used to talk about North America. It wasn't that long ago that this was the frontier, where we live. There were, Europeans were first coming, and this was the frontier. But that frontier had other people and other animals and living creatures. So, it may have been the frontier to the Europeans who came, but it wasn't the frontier to the Mi'kmaq or the Haudenosaunee or the Wendat. And when this land was colonized and settled by Europeans, it was declared terra nullius. It was nobody's land. And we're doing the same thing with Mars and the moon. Who gets to go to Mars? Who gets to claim it? Who gets to have property on Mars and build houses? Who gets to mine it or to break up its ice caps for water or do whatever we want to do? And are we doing, and that reason Indigenous knowledge is important because we're starting to do the same thing to Mars. We talk about Mars as a place for humans to go and to settle. But we actually still don't know if there's life on Mars. There could still be, we sent missions and we haven't found evidence for life. We still haven't found life, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Just because I put a glass of water in the ocean and I don't see a shark, doesn't mean sharks don't exist. So there could be life on Mars, under the surface, under the ice caps, somewhere. And if we go there, are we taking the land from them? Are we sharing the land properly? Are we imposing our own will? Does Mars have a right to exist? But, Mars is beautiful all on its own. Mars has existed for millions of years, billions of years, as a beautiful rock, red dust, living in its own way. And if humans go there, are we going to terraform it? Are we going to turn it into a world of land and water that suits us? Do we have that right to do that to Mars? Does Mars have a right to exist on its own? These are big questions, bigger questions than probably I can ever answer. But I think we should ask these questions. We should always ask, whose land and whose space? How are we sharing? Because that's really the end. Is how are we sharing space? And how are we sharing our view of it? We see colonization in different ways. Light pollution is bad. But you know why it's bad? But for me, I find it hurts a little. I live in Toronto and I have a pretty good view of the night sky. But I can never see Mewn. I can never really see Mewn. Or the other stories of the Mi'kmaq people. Because of all this light pollution, nasty light pollution. And this light pollution is erasing our stories. And recently, we're putting all these satellites into space, constellations called Starlink, and these satellites are going to go around the Earth and deliver services. And they're so bright, we can see them zipping across the sky. you know, in the same way we can look for meteorites different times of year, we'll see these satellites all the time. And these, if light pollution erases our stories, mega constellations rewrite them. And it's not just, and I should kind of explain this, you know, indigenous peoples here have stories, but everyone has stories. Every people around this world. No matter where you're from, there are stories about the night sky, and they're important. So I guess what I want you all to take away and think about, the night sky is, and the universe is indigenous. We are a part of it. You know, people like to say we're made of star stuff because the carbon and the iron that's in our bodies come from stars. But indigenous people call themselves star people because we come from the stars too. We have similar knowledges and understandings. And we have a connection to the universe that we need to share and to blend and consider in the same way we talk about sending missions to Mars and satellites all over the night sky. So thanks everyone. I hope we have a good talk about all this stuff.
Thank you. I'm just gonna make sure we pin our organizers, but if you haven't already had a look on Slido, we do have a number of questions. So I think I'll ask Prachi if maybe you could share your screen, and we can have you also look at all of these questions and address them.
Wow, these are fun questions. Is Ursa Major ever thought of as another animal? That is a good question, and I honestly don't know. Every story related to Ursa Major or the Big Dipper is almost always been, yes. It is, in some Cree stories, Ursa Major is a badger. But most of the time, and in the far north, Ursa Major is a reindeer or a caribou. So that's pretty cool. So for Inuit, reindeer or caribou. But for many stories, it's a bear. Sometimes it's a bear alone with a tail. Sometimes it's a bear and hunters. Sometimes it's a bear and cubs. But most of the time that I'm aware of, it's a bear. Is the moon ever named after an animal? That's another hard question. I don't think the moon is ever named after an animal. Usually the moon by many indigenous peoples is seen as a grandmother or a grandfather. But in some stories, if you look at the face of the moon, so if you're in the north, you might talk about the man in the moon. In some stories elsewhere, it could be a rabbit or an ant. How long would it take to inhabit Mars? That's a tough one. So if we want to go to Mars, it'll take most of a year to travel there, depending on when we do it. And so we'll have to send up lots and lots of supplies ahead of time, like tents, construction equipment, food and rations. And so it would take a year to get there. It'd probably take months to set up. But people then, once we have the technology largely to go there if we take the risk. But we can probably reasonably expect to go to Mars in the next 30 years. That's a good question. And it really depends on how willing people are to go. Has the sun ever been named by an animal? Again, no. Usually the sun and the moon are usually related in most questions. And so if the moon's usually a grandfather and the sun is a grandmother, or sometimes it's a mother. Rarely is the sun an animal. How did the sun dagger come? Well, the sun dagger was made by people. People observe the sun, and if you're fortunate enough to visit the southern United States, the sky is so clear that you can actually trace the line of the sun every day across the land. And the line that it creates will move north and south depending on the time of year. And so with lots of time and experience, you can start constructing these kinds of sun daggers and build these constructions. So they did it through lots of time and experience. Did Indigenous peoples use moon for tides? I'm sure some did. Many Indigenous peoples were sailors. My own people would sail between Newfoundland and PEI and Cape Breton. And so they would look at so the tides would be very important. And they would know when the tides were big and small, not necessarily by saying the moon is big, it's this, and knowing that the moon caused it, but by knowing that they are related. How did First Nations understand the sun dagger? Well, they understood it by lots of observations. If you observe the path of the sun for generations, you get a very good perspective. And that's the thing about a lot of Indigenous knowledges. Indigenous knowledges tend to be very old, spanning generations, thousands of years in some cases. This is why why it's very interesting that the Big Dipper is largely seen as a bear, because it's seen as stories living for tens of thousands of years and being shared. So they understood the sun dagger by lots and lots of observations and work and telling stories and knowing the land. Do we have people that oppose the colonization Mars or terraform it with nuclear weapons? I think we do have people that oppose colonizing Mars. I think a lot of it comes from understanding, well, how we operate on Earth and why we colonize Mars. A lot of people talk about going to Mars as a planet B, or a way of protecting ourselves from keeping ourselves safe if Earth is ever in danger. I think everybody has a different perspective. Some people want to do it, and some people don't. We have lots of things we can do, and we don't have to colonize Mars. I think more people would be against terraforming with nuclear weapons, as that's a very scary thing to do, is to ship a nuclear weapon into space. If there's an accident or anything. What is the cause of the red sun? Well, the red sun is usually caused by the weather. So you have if you have like forest fires or smoky stuff in the sky, that can make the sun look red, or in the horizon make it look red. And that's because the particles will bend light more. So the sun is red or appears orange because the light from the sun that comes towards us goes through the atmosphere. And the sun has a lot of blue light. That blue light gets scattered away. And so what's left is that orange light. So if you increase the number of particles in the atmosphere, it'll make the sun look redder. Why could a rock have rights? Why should we have rights? I mean, the rock was there before us. Many Indigenous peoples think of rocks and animals as relationships. We come from a place where we're not above these things. For me, a bear is, my people may hunt bears, but we also see it as kin in a relation. So we consider it having rights because they're there and they're part of nature. And so a rock can have rights in its own way. Is there a way to decrease light pollution but still use electricity? And I think the related question is, how can light pollution come? Yeah, light pollution is actually kind of simple to solve, and it's kind of silly that we don't do it enough. Most of the light pollution in cities is caused by buildings that don't turn off their lights, like business towers and all that, but also street lights. Most street lights, their lights go in every direction. So they illuminate the road below, and they shine out every direction, up and down. If we just put a shield on top of the light, and maybe put a mirror on the inside of that shield, so the light that goes up will reflect downwards, we can actually block a lot of light from going into space, into the sky. And we could actually it'd be actually really cool for electricity, because you don't need to use a strong light bulb if you reflect from the light downwards. So you can actually save electricity. So it's really beneficial in many ways. We just don't do it. Many places don't do it. Did any indigenous peoples not study the stars? I haven't met any. You know, one of the things about this world is everyone has a night sky. And so everyone would have seen the stars and studied it. You know, so if they never really worried about the stars, they would have studied it in one way or another. They would, just by noticing it. What is the brightest thing in the sky, not including the sun and the moon? Ooh. Well, it depends a little bit where you are. I think Sirius is the brightest star. Venus is the brightest planet. If you're in the southern hemisphere, the Magellanic Clouds are the brightest galaxies, or the Milky Way is pretty bright too. So lots of things, there are lots of options depending on which thing you want to talk about. Did indigenous peoples have telescopes? No, not in the way we talk about telescopes today. You know, the idea of mirrors and glass technology and magnifying, that came out of Europe. You know, and that came out of Europe around 1600s. You know, so about 400 years ago. And you know, indigenous peoples can use them today, but we didn't have their own. We didn't invent telescopes on our own. When you go into space, will your eyes hurt because of the sun? I've never thought of that. That's a cool question. I guess depends on where you are in space. If you get further away, the dimmer the sun will appear, so the less and less you get hurt. But if you're probably just above the Earth in space, I would recommend looking at the sun either way. That seems pretty bad. What are 6 dwarf planets? I don't know them all off the top of my head. There's Ceres and Pluto. I want to call it Xena, but they actually changed its name. And I can't remember them. But when I teach classes, I don't remember the names of anything. Which planet has the most rings? I guess that would be Saturn, in my mind. So, you know, because there are rings around some of the other planets. They're very small. Which planet has the most moons other than the gas giant? So if we ignore Saturn and Jupiter, and I think you also mean we ignore Neptune and Uranus, which are ice giants, then that leaves Venus, Mercury, Earth, and Mars. And well, Mars has 2. Earth, technically we speak of Earth having 1, but it has a couple of very tiny satellites as well. And Venus and Mercury have 0. So if we want to go with the normative setting, I guess Mars would be the one with the most moons with 2. But the Earth has a bunch of satellites that we don't usually call moons. Has any people wanted to sacrifice themselves and go to the sun? I haven't heard of that. It seems like a very difficult thing. That's a long trip. That seems kind of dull, and I'm not sure I would want to have get the sunburn. How far is the moon? Yeah, this is where I need Google. I never remember the numbers. It's far enough, you know. The thing that always bothers me about how far the moon is that it's getting further away. Over time, the moon is trying to get away from us. Can you live in Mars without a spacesuit? Well, you need some sort of protection. Temperature on Mars is like -50. That's cold. So you might want something to keep you warm. And the atmosphere is it's like 100 times thinner than yours, so it'll be very hard to breathe. So you need some trim out. I mean, you probably could survive a little while with a little bit of exposed skin, but it's going to be very painful. So I wouldn't want to risk it. I would want a spacesuit. Does the moon cause high tides? Indeed, it does. It is one of the main causes of high tides. You know, it's gravity at its best. Will the left shoulder of Orion blow up supernova? Oh yeah. This is one of my favorite questions. This is something I get to do research on sometimes too. So the left shoulder of Orion is also called Betelgeuse. And it is a very old star that's very red. And as a very old red star, it is a supergiant nearing the end of its life. But we're not sure how long that's going to take. It could be tomorrow or 100,000 years from now, and probably going to be closer to 100,000 years. But we're very certain it's going to blow up supernova one day. And it's going to be cool because it's possible we might be able to see it with our unaided eye. Well, I'm assuming I'll be around to see it. I tend to live another 100,000 years. But it's going to be pretty cool. When is there going to be the next space mission? Well, we're doing space missions all the time. So the next, I'm not even sure what the next major one is. I don't know. They happen so frequently now. It's hard to keep track of.
Well, I think the next one, is it the James Webb? That comes to mind.
Is the Webb launch? It could be. I know there's always missions to the International Space Station. That's very common, like supply runs and stuff.
Right.
Will our sun ever go supernova? Alas, no. For a star to go supernova, it has to be pretty heavy. And takes about 8 times the mass of our own sun to go supernova. So our sun will have to be 8 times heavier for that to happen. So our sun won't go supernova. What it'll do is something pretty cool in its own way. As it gets old, it'll turn into a red giant star and it'll expand and expand and expand and get redder and redder. And eventually, it just kind of can't expand anymore and it will just start shedding material. Think of like a snake shedding its skin over and over again and just sheds the material and it will become something called the Planetary Nebula. And one day after it's a Planetary Nebula, it will be a white dwarf star, which is really cool in its own right. Of course, at that time, the Earth will probably not be here in the same way. But unfortunately, it will never go supernova. It'll just turn into a white dwarf. Will Betelgeuse form a black hole? That's a question we really can't guarantee the answer is, but the most likely answer is no. To form a star goes supernova, and what happens from a supernova is you can form a neutron star or a black hole. But most black holes wait until it's has to be like 20 times the mass of the sun, and everything between 8 and 20 is typically a neutron star. There may be some special situations where it can form a black hole, but we don't think that's going to be the case. We think it's going to be a neutron star for Betelgeuse. Can we reach another galaxy in our lifetime? I'm afraid not. Another galaxy, we have to go, a few tens of thousands of light years. And go tens of thousands of light years will take more than tens of thousands of years. Because we can't travel that fast yet. We need to go faster than the speed of light to reach a galaxy in our lifetime. And space is just too big.
Which leads into the next question.
How big is space? Well, how big is space depends a little bit what you're asking. There's the space we see, how big is space we observe, and how big is space in general. Because we can't see all of space. Mm-hmm. One of the funny things because light travels at a certain speed, we can only, and that speed is the speed of light. And so when we talk about distance in light years, that's the distance light travels in 1 year. And so our universe is 13.7 billion years old. It's really old. But light can only have traveled that distance, 13.7 billion light years. So space is that we see is 13.7 billion light years. So that's how big it is of what we can see. Of what we can't see is probably about 50 billion light years or so. When will Milky Way and Andromeda collide? Well, that's a great focus of research for a lot of people. And the best guess is somewhere around 5 billion years from now. Because what they're going to do is they're going to dance around each other and eventually mix together and merge and be called the Milky Dromeda, perhaps. Why is there a galaxy called the Milky Way? Well, not everyone calls it the Milky Way. You know, my people call it the Spirit Road, and some people call it a river. But we call it the Milky Way because if you look up in the night in a very dark place, it looks like a river of milk. How many stars are in the universe? Well, I tried counting them once. I didn't get very far. But in our galaxy, there are probably about 100 billion or so. And there are probably 100 billion galaxies in our universe, at least. So that's a starting point. So if you want a comparable challenge, go to a beach and try counting every piece of sand. That's how hard it is. What's the closest galaxy and what is its name? Well, there are some galaxies, very tiny galaxies that orbit us that are pretty close. But the closest major galaxies are called the Magellanic Clouds. And they're about 70,000 light years away. I know it in a different unit, but not light years. And so the Magellanic Clouds, if you go into the southern hemisphere, you can see them with your unaided eye. After that, the closest galaxy that's like us is Andromeda. Are there bugs in space? There might be. One of the funky things that's happened is, we set up satellites and missions in space, and sometimes they took up something called the Tardigrade. And the Tardigrade is this little fat creature with 6 legs kind of thing. But it has this crazy ability that it can survive in zero gravity and basically in the cold of space. It just basically goes to sleep and hides away. Then if you take it out and you bring it back to Earth, it'll wake itself up eventually and be all right. So there may well be bugs in space. I don't really like bugs on Earth, so I'm not really too enthusiastic to think too much about bugs in space. Well, if humans can survive in space, pretty much anything can survive in space. Humans are pretty fragile creatures. Now, granted, we've never tried to send an elephant into space, but we've sent dogs and monkeys and insects into space, and they've all survived in different ways. Which is bigger, blue giant, red giant, or red supergiant? So in bigger, I'm going to assume you mean in size in terms of how big the ball is. And typically a red supergiant is bigger than a blue and a red giant. Have I ever been to space? No, I've never been to outer space. It's just only my imagination. What is a blue moon? Well, a blue moon is a bit of a colloquialism. So I told you in a year there's 12 and sometimes 13 moons. And the full moon takes about 28, 29 days to repeat. So a full moon to the next full moon is that long time. But a month is 30 or 31 days. So a blue moon is what happens when you get a full moon twice in 1 month. Are there homes in other planets? Could be. I'm going to assume by other homes is there life on other planets, perhaps. There could be life on Mars. People have talked about life on Venus, perhaps life on some of the moons of Jupiter. We may find there's life on other planets. And if we go around other stars, we may find there's life that's like us, that we consider intelligent and communicative and technological and built homes and does all these different things. How old is the nearest sun? So our sun is about 4.5 billion years old. And the closest star to that, main star, is called Alpha Centauri, and that's about the same age. Not that far, not that different.
All right, final question.
When the sun enters its red giant phase, will Uranus be habitable? I feel like this is a joke.
Might not be.
I'm going to treat it as that, but I'm also going to say Uranus. Well, Uranus is pretty hard to, doesn't really have a surface that we could stand on. So habitable is a little difficult, but it could be that we could build stations in the station planes or aircraft carriers in the atmosphere of Uranus that can host humans. So that area could become habitable in some way, or at some distance from the sun, it will be a habitable zone where people can live. Yeah, those are fun questions.
Yes, so I want to thank everyone for asking all of those questions, and a special thanks to our speaker. Thank you very much for joining us today, sharing these stories. I think it has widened my perspective for sure on the different ways I think the night sky can be interpreted and is interpreted and celebrated. So I want to thank you on behalf of all of us, and we look forward to seeing everyone next week. As Prati mentioned, we have our next speaker also scheduled. If you haven't already done so, please use the poll and give us your feedback. And with that, we will officially end tonight's session. So thank you once again, and we'll see you next week. Bye.